I've known Jack Brawns for many years. He is a superb doctor, a survivor of the Holocaust, and an inspiration to all who know him. Jack spent his childhood years in the hell of the Kovno ghetto. His father, a doctor, worked night and day in the ghetto to try to save Jewish life. Jack Brawns' story of medicine in the Kovno ghetto is an inspiring story of survival and an important addition to our knowledge of the Holocaust.
It has been over 50 years since the tragedy of the Holocaust. My name is Dr. Jack Brawns. I was born in Lithuania and spent 3 years in Kovno ghetto and 1 year in Dachau before being liberated at the end of the war. From 1957 to the present time, I have been in private practice in California, specializing in general surgery. The following presentation has a special importance to me. My father, Dr. Moses Brawns, was considered a top epidemiologist, infectionist in the country. It is because of his medical expertise and compassion for human suffering that I and many others survived this chapter in history. Much has been written, documented, and discussed about the Holocaust period, but very little has been written, documented, and discussed about medicine during the Holocaust. You will learn about the patient, the heroic behavior of the physicians, and the entire ghetto population that participated in the conspiracy of silence and did not betray the existence of certain diseases. The information for this presentation was prepared from notes of my father, Dr. Moses Brawns. The notes were written in the ghetto for a lecture presented to his medical colleagues. It is very lucky that my father was a historian and wrote everything down on paper. He described the prevalent diseases in the ghetto and their morbidity. To understand the importance of this presentation, Medicine in the Kovno ghetto, it is essential for me to describe the mosaic of life in the ghetto at the time. Mr. Avraham Tori, secretary of the Ältestenrat, meticulously and diligently collected all documents during the Kovno ghetto years from 1941 to 1944. Mr. Tori engaged Esther Luria, an artist, to visually document the events of that period of time. With the help of these drawings, we will be able to recreate the mosaic of life in the ghetto. On the 22nd of June 1941, the German army crossed the German-Soviet border, and that was the start of the war between Germany and the Soviet Union. Our lives were changed immediately. Before the German army entered Kovno, where I lived with my family, the so-called Lithuanian partisans, who called themselves also patriots, massacred thousands of Jews. The Jews were raped, stabbed, shot in their houses, and their belongings were stolen. The only medical facility available to the Jews was the previously nationalized Jewish hospital, Bikur Cholim. I was working as a clerk in the hospital and witnessed the beginning of the Jewish tragedy. The situation was aggravated by the fact that the ambulances refused to take the wounded Jews to the hospital, and the streets were extremely dangerous for the Jews. On July 19, 1941, the German authorities advised the Ältestenrat that the only way to protect the Jews from the Lithuanians was to separate them and to move the Jews into the ghetto, where they would be protected by the German authorities. A section of the city was selected for the site of the ghetto. This section was called Slobodka, or in Lithuanian was called Vilijampolė. The geographic site of the ghetto was at Lithuanian request gradually decreased. In July 1941, the Jews started moving into the ghetto, and on August 15, the ghetto gates were closed. Slobodka was the most neglected suburb in the city of Kovno. It consisted of small wooden houses with no running water, no sewers. The water supply came from wells, with the outhouses built often less than 12 meters distance from each other, as prescribed by law. In the space designated for the ghetto, about 5,000 to 6,000 people lived there prior to the onset of the war. On August 15, when the gates of the ghetto were closed, about 29,000 people were moved into the ghetto. On July 19, 1941, the Department of the Lithuanian municipality entrusted Dr. Moses Brauns with the task of preparing a sanitary medical project for the future ghetto. On August 4, 1941, a project was submitted to establish in the ghetto a general hospital and a contagious diseases hospital. The Lithuanian municipality did not provide a thing for the proposed project and ordered the Jews to supply all the necessary equipment for the establishment of the hospital. The hospital inventory and medical equipment were collected and assembled by the medical personnel who received the supplies from the ghetto inmates. The ghetto medical department was also responsible for 153 children from a children's home and 50 seniors from an old age home. There was a little ghetto and a big ghetto with a bridge connecting them. In the little ghetto on Panerių Street, there was a brick building which housed a school. A general hospital of the ghetto was established with departments for general surgery, internal medicine, and gynecology. A hospital was also established for contagious diseases in the little ghetto. This was a two-floor wooden house which was used by the Lithuanians as an old age home. The house was far from suitable for infectious diseases. There was no isolation facilities, no adequate water supply or sewage disposal, and no adequate heating. However, there was no alternative. Equipment was gathered from the inmates in the ghetto. On August 14th, all the Jewish patients from various city hospitals, TB sanatoriums, children's home, and medical institutions were brought to the ghetto. The patients with contagious diseases were separated and placed in the hospital for contagious diseases. Amongst the patients were those who suffered from typhoid fever, scarlet fever, diphtheria, and stages of tuberculosis. On August 15, 1941, the gates of the ghetto were closed, and the nightmare began for Dr. Moses Brauns, the infectionist epidemiologist. I would like to outline the causes for the outbreak of epidemics. There were three factors: sanitary conditions, starvation, and psychological warfare. The first factor, sanitary conditions. There was no running water. The water supply came from the wells. There was no bathing facilities in the dwellings or in public baths. The first public bath was not opened until 1942. There were no sewers. After the closing of the ghetto, the emptying of the excrements from the outhouses was halted by order of the German and Lithuanian authorities. With the population increasing to 29,000 in the ghetto, all the outhouses were filled to capacity in no time. The winter of 1941 was one of the coldest winters. No new holes for the outhouses could be dug. In addition, the outhouses were dismantled and the wood was used for heating in order to survive the cold winter. The excrements were all exposed as frozen icicles. What would happen in the springtime when the excrements would melt and inundate the ghetto with potential epidemics. This was the question on the mind of Dr. Moses Browns. But spring came and new holes were dug by the ghetto inhabitants. The old ones were covered with dirt. Unfortunately, however, some of the outhouses were constructed too close to the wells. With the increase of the population to 29,000, 1.5 square meter was allotted per person. The heating conditions were a disaster. A very small amount of wood was distributed for heating and cooking on a weekly basis. Periodically, no wood would arrive at all for distribution of the ghetto inhabitants. The second factor, starvation. Hunger began on the first day of the ghetto's establishment. In Lithuania, there was always enough food, and therefore nobody stored food away for another day. After closure of the ghetto gates, the people began to smuggle food into the ghetto through barbed wires or by carrying it when they returned from work outside of the ghetto. Many people were shot to death while doing so, but there were always men bold in spirit who continued to bring in food. Food. The main foods that were sent into the ghetto for the Jews were bread, meat, potatoes, and sauerkraut. All these products were of inferior quality. The bread. The bread was supplied by Lithuanian Commercial Association called Parama. The bread was sent to the Jews, contained more moisture than allowed, and it was moldy. A lot of the spoiled bread was not eatable. Our hunger rations of bread was already reduced. It was created by the fact that there were approximately 2,000 inmates that the Nazis did not know about. They were hidden in the ghetto. Most of them were children, aged, and ailing people. For them, there was no allowance of food. The people of the ghetto shared their food with them and did not betray the findings to the German or Lithuanian authorities. The meat. The meat was supplied by Lithuanian Commercial Association called Maistas. Sometimes the association sent batches of horses' heads instead of meat to the ghetto. These heads were already spoiled, and when they were brought to the ghetto, they were not fit for human consumption. In the ghetto, there was no natural ice, artificial ice, or refrigerations. Vegetables. The supply of vegetables was provided by the Lithuanian Commercial Association Sodyba. Jewish workers from the ghetto were sent to the association to pick up the vegetables. They noted many barrels of sauerkraut, with inscription, spoiled only for the use in the ghetto. The winter 1941 was very cold. At that time, the potatoes were frozen and spoiled in big quantities, and the Commercial Association sent the spoiled potatoes to the ghetto. The third and the most important factor, the psychological warfare, destruction of the mind. The Jews living in the ghetto witnessed on a regular basis the execution of their fellow Jews. On October 28, 1941, the Great Action, 9,200 Jews were taken to the Ninth Fort and killed. In February 1942, the Riga Action, 1,000 Jews were taken from the ghetto to be transported to Riga, never to return. On October 26, 1943, was the Estonian Action. More than 1,500 Jews were taken from the ghetto to Estonia. But the most terrible action was the Children's Action, which took place on March 26 and 27, 1944, where several hundred children were taken to the Ninth Fort and executed. All these experiences, the worries, the fear, could not pass without any effect on the ghetto inmates. On September 19, 1941, a pharmacy was established. The Germans assigned one pharmacy in Viliampoli for the ghetto, which had very few medications. It seemed as if someone had removed the good medications before the pharmacy was transferred for use in the ghetto. On Saturday, October 4, 1941, the hospital for contagious diseases was set afire. All the patients, including the physician Dr. Davidovich and staff, were trapped and perished. Reports were spread by the Nazis that the hospital was destroyed because patients who suffered from leprosy were treated there. This was another outrageous fabrication because no leprosy patients were present in the ghetto. On the same day, in the small ghetto, the building housing the general hospital, the children's home, home for the aged, was cut off the ghetto. The patients from the general hospital, children from the children's hospital, and the old people from the aged home were taken to the 9th Fort and executed. During mid-December 1941, a new general hospital was established in another part of the ghetto. Once again, the ghetto inmates supplied all the necessary equipment. The general hospital had a department for surgery, internal medicine, and gynecology. No new hospital for contagious diseases was established. The German authorities strictly prohibit pregnancy in the ghetto with the warning of the death penalty to both the mother and the newborn. Approximately 50 abortions took place on a monthly basis. It was known at the time that the Nazis executed all Russian war prisoners who had contact with spotted fever. So many thousands of Russian war prisoners were executed because of spotted fever, which they never had. After the burning of the contagious disease hospital, Dr. Moses Brown decided that the diagnosis of contagious diseases has to be eliminated in the ghetto. In a secret agreement with Dr. Elkes, chairman of the board of the Ältestenrat, he started treating secretly affected patients without isolation. The children were removed from the room to stay with relatives or family friends, and the Ältestenrat allocated extra soap and wood for heating purposes for the patient. No contagious disease was ever reported to the Lithuanian Health Department. Infectious diseases, spotted fever or Rickettsia prowazekii, transmitted by lice. The infected louse bites the patient. The patient will scratch the site of the bite, and the excrement of the infected louse will infect the patient through the broken skin. During the time from the beginning of the ghetto, August 15, 1941, to the liquidation of the ghetto, July 13, 1944, Dr. Moses Brown treated 70 cases of spotted fever. It was striking that most of the cases had a mild course. The patient with spotted fever came from two places. One was inside the ghetto and the other was outside the ghetto. Inside the ghetto was a workshop which had a department of used clothing. The clothing came from the battlefield to be repaired. The clothes were dirty, and despite the fact that they underwent disinfection in Germany or in the sanitary baths in Kaunas, sometimes they contained living lice. Outside of the ghetto. In the summer of 1941, the Camp Zhezhmarai was liquidated. The remaining inmates, about 80 of them, were brought to the ghetto. Among them were about 9 patients suffering from spotted fever. The administration of Zhezhmarai did not know about the presence of this kind of patient. All recovered without any complication. One of the nurses in the ghetto, who also was in contact with the patient, became ill. However, her course was also very mild and she recovered. Another epidemic of spotted fever occurred in February of 1942, which was outside the ghetto, with the source being the Entlausungsanstalt. The ghetto sent a team of workers to the German sanitary baths, Entlausungsanstalt. The baths were for servicemen who were on their way to their home in Germany. Also wounded servicemen who arrived had to pass the Entlausungsanstalt on their way to Germany. Many of the wounded soldiers were infested with lice. The Jewish team worked on the dirty side. while the Lithuanian team worked on the clean side of the Entlausungsanstalt. The function of the Jewish workers was as follows. The Jewish workers had to carry the wounded servicemen from the train to the sanitary baths. The Jewish barbers had to shave them. There were about 6 barbers. The clothes were removed from the patients. Frequently, the ovens were not functioning well and the clothes had living lice. The Entlausungsanstalt became a source of the disease transmitted by living lice. The word typhus exanthematicus, or spotted fever, was replaced with the diagnosis of grippe, influenza, pneumonia, and brain grippe. Nobody spoke of typhus or spotted fever. Fortunately, outside of the ghetto, in the German sanitary baths, the Jewish workers were not on a nominal list. The workers were replaced by other men, and the Germans did not notice the absence of 6 Jewish workers. About 70 cases of spotted fever were treated with only 3 fatal cases. This is about 4.3%. It is a not very high rate of mortality under the circumstances. Typhus fever, typhus abdominalis, transmitted through the gastrointestinal tract. At the time of the Great Action of October 28, 1941, there were 8 patients. They were all dressed up and passed the selection line without being recognized that they were sick. All of them recovered. In the ghetto, there were cases of typhus abdominalis. In autumn 1942 and in the spring 1943, in 2 different parts of the ghetto, we had 2 different epidemical outbreaks of contagious bowel diseases, which involved about 18 to 20 cases each time. The course of the disease was very mild. Some were complicated cases with intestinal hemorrhage, but they recovered. The source of this outbreak were 2 water wells. The water was tested in the ghetto laboratory and they confirmed the diagnosis of typhus abdominalis. The wells were closed temporarily with the explanation that we found bodies of 2 dead cats in them. After disinfection of the wells, they were reopened again and nobody mentioned this incident. During the period of the ghetto, 80 cases of typhus abdominalis were treated with no fatalities. Infectious hepatitis, 1 case treated and recovered. Scarlet fever, this was very rare and always had a totally different course than the cases which happened in Kaunas before the war. There were a total of 3 children with scarlet fever with a very mild course. Diphtheria. During the existence of the ghetto, there was about 30 patients with the disease. The only treatment for the disease in the period of that time was the use of anti-diphtheria serum. The majority of the patients did not receive anti-diphtheria serum. There was not a single fatality from diphtheria. It is easy to understand how much the lack of sanitary conditions, starvation, and psychological stress could have an influence on the development of epidemics. But contrary to the expectation of those in the ghetto, there were no serious epidemics and the Jews did not die from them. This was because of the determined will of the patient to survive and the relentless care of the physicians. It was Dr. Moses Brown's philosophy and belief that the psychological factors play an important role and that the mental attitude of the patient determines the progress and the outcome of the disease. Thank you very much.